Tonight, we are going to spend a long, quiet night inside a house that no longer stands, in a city that has since forgotten it. Nothing here will ask anything of you. If these slow walks through old houses help you drift off, it would mean a lot if you subscribed. There is a new one waiting every week. Let us begin. It was winter in the year 1895, and the snow had been falling on Fifth Avenue since the middle of the afternoon. Scene 1. The house going quiet. The house stood on a corner where the avenue widened, and it was built of limestone the color of old cream. In daylight, it looked heavy and rather severe, the way those houses did. At night, under snow, it looked softer than it was. There were 4 floors above the street and 2 below it. The carved stone around the windows held small ridges. Snow settled into those ridges. It made a pale outline of every leaf and every scroll the stone cutters had put there. No one looked up at that carving very often. It was there anyway. Inside, the last carriage of the evening had already gone, and the house had begun to let go of the day. You would have heard it leave, standing in the entrance hall. The horses shifting on the packed snow, the soft thud of a door, then wheels muffled, moving away up the avenue. The sound thinned out and joined the hush of a city under weather. The great door closed. A man in dark livery slid the bolt across. The sound it made was not loud. It was a small, dry knock of metal against metal, then nothing. That was the moment the house began to change, though nobody in it would have said so. It is difficult to describe how a house changes when its guests have gone. Nothing moves, no one announces it, but the air seems to settle. It settles the way water settles in a basin after a hand is lifted out of it. The rooms go back to being rooms. They are not stages anymore. The entrance hall was floored in marble, laid in a pattern of large squares. During the evening, that floor had been loud. Heels on stone, the particular click of a woman's shoe, the drag of a heavy hem, voices going up into the stairwell and coming back thinned. Now was a man crossing it, and he crossed it slowly. His own footsteps were the only footsteps in the house. There was a mirror in that hall, tall and framed in gilt, and it had been hung where anyone coming in would pass it. At night, it held nothing but the shape of the room and the small, still flame of the lamp at the foot of the stairs. He went first to the cloakroom off the hall and looked at the long row of brass hooks. Empty. He looked anyway. It was habit, and habit is most of what any of us do at the end of a working day. Then he began putting the hall back together. This is a thing that hardly ever gets written down. A great house held an evening the way a table holds a meal. Afterward, somebody had to clear it. Not dramatically, not all at once, simply item by item. It was the way you would tidy a room you knew you would stand in again tomorrow. He straightened the runner of carpet that ran from the door to the foot of the stairs. He hooked it back square with the toe of his shoe. He set the umbrella stand upright Somebody had left a folded newspaper on the hall table. He took it and tucked it under his arm to be carried down later. A newspaper left on a hall table would be noticed in the morning. It was easier to move it now. The chairs against the wall he did not touch. They were not for sitting in. It is not the kind of chair anyone sits in. They had been made to be looked at, and they had been looked at all evening. Now they could rest. There was also a card tray on the hall table, silver, with 3 or 4 cards lying in it from earlier in the week. Those would be gone through in the morning by somebody whose business it was. At this time of night, they were simply small white rectangles in a dish. At the foot of the staircase there was a lamp burning. The stair itself curved up into the dark. It was wide enough for 3 people to climb side by side. The balustrade was carved wood, dark and polished, warm to the hand. Halfway up, there was a landing where the stair turned. On that landing was a tall window. Behind that window, there was nothing tonight but blue and falling snow. He went up as far as the landing, and he stopped there. It was on his way. It was also worth stopping for. He looked out. The avenue below was empty. Snow had already covered the tracks of the last carriage. The gas lamps stood at their intervals down the length of the street. Each one held its own small, warm circle. In the falling snow, those circles looked soft at the edges, like light seen through fabric. Beyond the far sidewalk was the low stone wall of the park. Beyond that, the bare trees. Beyond the trees, nothing that could be made out at all. He watched for perhaps a minute, standing there on the landing, with his hand on the rail, perhaps less. He took the stairs on the inside of the curve, where the treads were widest and quietest. Then he went on up the stairs, into the dark part of the house. There were 17 rooms on the floors above him, and most of them were already dark. That is the part people find hardest to imagine about a house like this one when they picture it now. They picture it lit. They picture every window burning, the way it looks in a painting. It is not like that. A house of that size was mostly dark most of the time, and it had to be. Light was work. Light was oil to be carried, and wicks to be trimmed, and glass to be wiped. In the newer parts of the house, it was a gas key turned, and a small blue flame held to the mantel. Nobody lit a room that nobody was standing in. Not because of the cost, because of the labor. So the second floor was dark, except for one corridor lamp turned low. The third floor was dark entirely. The ballroom had held music earlier in the season and would hold it again. Tonight it was dark and cold, its shutters closed. Its chairs stood against the wall in a long, patient row. No one would open that room again for days. There is a sound a house makes when it lets go of the day. He passed the door of the ballroom on his way and did not open it. There was nothing to check in a room that had been shut for days. Even so, he put 2 fingers against the panel as he went by, which was a habit he had picked up somewhere and had never examined. You can feel the stillness of a closed room through its door. Once you have spent enough years in houses, the house breathed out. Wood does this at night in winter. It has been warm all day, and now it is cooling. As it cools, it moves very slightly and makes small sounds. A stair tread ticks. A door frame gives a single knock. A floorboard settles under a rug with a sound like someone turning over in bed. Anyone who has lived in an old house knows these sounds. They stop hearing them within a week. The servants knew them as a language. They could tell you which stair it was and roughly what hour it usually spoke. On the third floor, a young housemaid was going along the corridor with a candle in a low glass holder, closing doors that had been left open during the day. She did this every night. There was no reason given for it, and none needed. Closed doors kept the heat where it belonged, and they kept the drafts in the corridor instead of in the rooms, and they made the corridor look finished when the family came up. She was young. She had been in the house since the spring. Her shoes were soft-soled because the house preferred not to hear its own staff. Within a fortnight, she had learned to walk on the outer edge of the corridor. The floor did not speak there. She closed the door of the small blue sitting room. She closed the door of the room where the linen presses stood. At the corner where the corridor turned, she stopped. The window there had frost on it in a pattern she had not seen before. Ferns of it climbed up from the bottom corner. She held the candle close for a moment to look. The frost went orange where the light touched it, and the whole pattern seemed for a moment to be made of something warm. She moved the candle away, and it went blue again. She did that twice. It is the sort of thing anyone does when they are alone in a corridor at night, and no one is waiting for them. Then she went on down the corridor. She had been told, in her first week, the order in which the doors were to be closed, and the order made no sense to her then, and made perfect sense now. You go away from the stair, not toward it. Then you are not walking back through the dark part of the corridor when you have finished. Down below her, 2 floors and a world away, the family was still awake in the small sitting room at the front of the house. Not all of them, 2 of them. The rest had gone up. They were not doing anything remarkable. And it is worth saying that plainly. The imagination wants them doing something remarkable, and they almost never were. One of them was reading. The other was writing a letter for the morning post. She paused over it more than she wrote it, the way people do with letters that are not urgent. There was a fire in the grate. There was an oil lamp on the small table, though the room had gas fittings. The lamp gave a better light to read by. The family had grown up with lamps and preferred them. A cup of tea had gone lukewarm on the same table. It would not be finished. Nobody in that room was thinking about the house. People almost never think about the houses they live in. But the house was thinking about them in its way. On 4 floors and in 2 basements, A great many people were awake and moving. Nearly every one of them was doing something to make the next morning easier for those two. The furnace was being fed with coal from the bin. The kitchen fire was being banked low so that it could be woken quickly before dawn. Silver was being counted and put away. Boots were being taken down to be cleaned. A horse was being watered in the stable behind the house. A lamp was being carried from room to room. The man carrying it had one job at this hour, and it was lamps. None of them would be thanked for it, and none of them expected to be. That was not modesty. It was simply the shape of the work when the work is invisible. Every so often, one of them would look up, and the room would be exactly as still as it had been the last time, and that was the whole of the evening. Outside, the snow kept coming down, straight and unhurried, the way it does when there is no wind at all. It fell on the roof and on the carved stone. It fell on the wide steps at the front. It settled on the ironwork of the fence. Along the top of each iron rail, it built a thin white ridge, exactly the width of the rail, the way it always does. It fell on the avenue, and on the tracks, and on the long, empty sidewalk where nobody walked. It fell on the park across the way, on the bare trees, and on the winding paths that no one would walk until morning. And it fell on the roofs of the other houses up and down the street. Each one had its own staff, its own furnace, its own lamps going out one by one. There is a stillness that comes over a house at that hour, and it came over this one. On the hall table, the newspaper had been taken away and the surface wiped, and there was nothing on it now but the card tray and the shadow of the tray. The house grew quieter. The hall was in order. The corridors were closed. The stair curved up into the dark, and on the landing, the tall window held nothing but blue. In the pantry below, somebody set down a tray on a bench and left it there for the morning. Somewhere below, a small door shut, and the sound of it did not carry past the stairs. Above the roof, the snow kept coming down out of a sky that had not changed all evening and would not change before morning. The city slept. Scene 2, the lamp trimmer. There is a job in a house like that one, which has almost no name now, and it is worth naming. In some households, they called him the lamp man. In others, he was simply one of the footmen. And lamps were the part of the work that fell to him, the way boots fell to somebody else, and coal fell to somebody else again. In the ledgers, he might appear under nothing at all. But every evening of that winter, one man walked the whole building with a basket. The basket was full of light. Let us follow him for a while, from the bottom of the house to the top. He began in the butler's pantry on the ground floor, in a small room off the back stairs. It was warm in there, warmer than the corridors. The pantry sat above the kitchens and the heat came up through the floor. It smelled of two things mainly: metal polish and lamp oil. The oil was kept in a covered can with a narrow spout. The can stood on a shelf lined with oilcloth. Oil finds its way onto everything eventually, and wood remembers it forever. On the bench in front of him, there were 9 lamps. They were not identical. A house collects lamps the way it collects chairs. Some had come with the house. Some had come from an older house. 2 of them were newer than the rest, with a mechanism in the burner that the old ones did not have. He knew which was which without looking, the way you know your own kitchen in the dark. The first thing he did was wipe the chimneys. A lamp chimney is a tube of thin glass. It sits above the flame and gives it the draft it needs. It is a beautiful, useless-looking object. It is also the reason an oil lamp burns steadily instead of guttering. It gets dirty every night without exception. That is what it is for. He wiped each one with a soft cloth. He held it up to the light when he had finished, turning it slowly. He was looking for the film that always survives the first pass. When a chimney was clean, it looked as though there were nothing in his hand at all. He set them in a row on the bench, each one standing on its own small circle. 9 chimneys, and it had taken him the better part of a quarter of an hour, and it was the part of the work he liked least and did most carefully. Then he came to the wicks. A wick burns unevenly if you leave it alone. One corner takes more flame than the rest. A little black horn grows there. That horn is what makes a lamp smoke. It is what puts the thin gray ghost of soot on a white ceiling over a season. So every night the wick was trimmed. He did it with a small pair of scissors kept for nothing else. Flat across, then a slight rounding at the corners, so the flame would come up as a leaf and not as a tooth. It took him perhaps a quarter of a minute for each lamp. He had done it more times than he could have counted. You would not have called it skilled work if you had watched him. You would have been wrong. There is a way of holding a wick between finger and thumb. There is a way of feeling the moment the blade sits square. A man who has it can trim by touch alone in a dim room. He could and often did. Then the oil, never to the top. A lamp filled to the brim will weep from the collar when the oil warms. The weeping runs down the reservoir and onto the table. Someone else has that to clean. He filled to the mark. He wiped the collar. He set the chimney back in its gallery. He turned the small brass wheel until the wick stood where he wanted it. There was a second oil in that pantry as well, in a smaller can, for the 2 newer lamps that took a different grade. Mixing the 2 was the kind of error a man made once. A lamp burning the wrong oil will smoke and will go on smoking however you set the wick, and it takes an hour to find out why. 9 lamps ready on the bench. Then he loaded them into the basket. It was lined with felt so they would not knock together. He began to walk the house. The basket itself had a leather handle that had been stitched twice. He had carried it long enough that it had shaped itself to his forearm. The route was always the same, and it went from the bottom up. Ground floor first, then the family floor, then the bedroom floor, He carried one lit lamp for himself and the others dark. He set them where they belonged. Where he found one already standing, he took the used one away in exchange. That is the part people rarely picture. The lamps traveled. They were not fixed. A lamp had a home shelf and a working positions. Every night it made a small journey down to the pantry and back up again. It went in a felt-lined basket carried by a man in soft shoes. He set a lamp in the hall, on the table, by the door, where one always stood. He set one in the passage that ran to the back of the house. In the small sitting room at the front, 2 of the family were awake. He did not go in. That room's lamp was burning and would burn a while yet. He noted it, the way people who walk a route note a thing to come back to. Then he went on. The library was empty and warm, and the fire in it had been let down to embers hours before. He liked that room best, though he would not have said so to anyone. A preference of that kind is not really a servant's to have. It had a high ceiling and shelves on 3 sides. In the middle stood where the newspapers were laid out. In the mornings, at night, the shelves went dark blue-brown. The gold on the book spines picked up whatever light there was. It gave back a thin, dotted line all the way around the room. There was a smell in the library that he associated with nothing else. Leather and paper and cold ash from a fire, let down hours before, and under all of it, the faint sweetness of the polish that had been used on the shelves for years. He set a fresh lamp on the long table there and turned the wick low. Not because anyone was going to read. The room sat on the root between the family stair and the front of the house. A room that is entirely dark is a room people avoid. It had been decided, years before he arrived, that this room would not be dark. The back stairs were narrow, and they turned twice on the way up, and he had learned to carry the basket on the outside of the turn so that the lamps did not swing into the wall. He went up the back stairs with the basket on his arm. On the family floor, he changed the corridor lamps. There were 3. They stood in shallow niches in the wall, each with a mirror behind it. It is an old trick and a good one. The mirror doubles the light and costs nothing to run. The niches had small marble ledges, cool under his hand. Each one had a faint ring where lamps had stood for years. The corridor was carpeted end to end. The carpet took every sound he made. He wiped each niche ledge with the cloth from his pocket as he went, which was not strictly his work, and took perhaps 4 seconds each, and which he had done every night since he arrived, because a ring of oil on marble is much harder to remove after a month than after a day. At the far end there was a window with the curtains open. He crossed to it and drew them, hand over hand. The heavy fabric came together with a sound like a breath. Then he stood a moment. There was nothing left to do at that end of the corridor. It is a strange thing about a house at night. The moments of having nothing to do arrive in the middle of the work, not at the end of it. He wondered, some nights whether the lamps were noticed at all. It was not a bitter thought. He was not a bitter man. The position was a good one, and he knew what the alternatives were. It was simply the sort of question that comes to a person standing alone at the end of a corridor, 9 lamps behind him, and no one awake to see any of them. He had once, in a previous place, been in a house where the lamps were done badly. He remembered it clearly. Ceilings gray above the sconces. A smell in the curtains. A room that felt slightly wrong and that nobody could account for because the cause was too small and too constant to be seen. A lamp trimmed well looks like nothing. A lamp trimmed badly is noticed within the hour. That is the whole arithmetic of the work. He had known it since he was a boy. There was an older man in that house, the under-butler. He had been in service since before the family moved to the avenue. They took their supper at the same table in the servants' hall, late after the upstairs meal was cleared. Theirs was the kind of acquaintance built out of years. Once, early on, the younger man had said something about it. Not a complaint. Something closer to a joke that had come out wrong. The old man had thought about it while he finished his bread. "Nobody thanks the light," he said. "That is how you know it is working." Then he added a second sentence, because he was not a man who left one standing alone. "The night is a wide room, and somebody keeps the far end of it lit. If they knew you were doing it, you would be doing it badly." That was the whole of it. They went back to their supper. Neither man mentioned it again. The younger one carried it for the rest of his working life. There was a wall clock on the back stairs, high up, and he passed it going both ways, and did not look at it either time. He finished the corridor and went up to the bedroom floor. That took the least time. Most of those rooms had their own arrangements, and most of the doors were closed. He left one lamp on the landing, turned very low. It was left that way every night of the year. Then he came back down with the basket lighter than it went up. Coming down the back stairs with an empty basket is one of the great small pleasures of that kind of work, and anyone who has finished a round of anything will know exactly what is meant by it. In the pantry, he set the used lamps in their row to be dealt with in the morning. He wiped the bench. He put the scissors back in the drawer where the scissors lived. He closed the drawer, and the small brass handle knocked once against the wood. He turned down his own lamp until the flame was a low orange seed. He carried it out. He closed the pantry door behind him. The house behind him held its handful of small lights. One in the library, one on each landing, 3 in the corridor niches, 1 in the room at the front, where 2 people were awake and would be for a while yet. He put the roll of the evening behind him and did not think about any of it again. Nobody would look at any of them before morning. That was the point. That had always been the point. He would do the whole of it again tomorrow evening, and the evening after that, and he had done it the evening before. Outside, the snow kept coming down past the gas lamps in soft, vertical lines. Those lamps had a man, too. He walked the street with a pole at dusk, and again before dawn, doing the same work in a colder room. The wicks were trimmed, the chimneys were clean. The 9 of them stood where he had left them, each at the height he had set it. The light held through the whole of the night, with nobody there to see it. Scene 3. The dining room after dinner. There is another room in that house worth standing in for a while. The dining room was on the ground floor, at the back, away from the avenue. It had been built to hold a great many people. On most nights of the year it held 6 or 4, or nobody at all. The table was mahogany in 3 sections. The sections could be lifted out and stored against a wall down the corridor. Tonight, all 3 were in. The evening had been a large one. Now it was over. The family had gone through to the small sitting room an hour before. The candles on the table had been snuffed, not blown. Blowing sends wax across a cloth. Snuffing does not. What was left in the room was 2 footmen and a housemaid, and the slow business of putting a dinner away. 3 people and a room built for 24. They worked from the far end toward the door. That was the order, and there was a reason for it. You clear away from the exit. Then nothing has to be carried back across a room you have already finished. Nobody had explained this to any of them. They had learned it the way you learn which stair creaks. The room itself had been made for exactly this, and it showed in 100 small ways that nobody upstairs would have named. The walls were paneled to shoulder height in dark wood, and above the paneling the plaster had been colored a deep red, which was the fashion for dining rooms of that period. Red holds candlelight. A pale wall throws it back flat and makes a room look cold at night. A dark red one absorbs it and gives back only what it wants to, and every face at that table had looked better for it all evening. There were 2 doors, one for the family, wide and paneled, opening onto the corridor. One in the corner, narrow, papered on the outside to match the wall so that it half disappeared, opening onto the service passage. Everyone in the room used the second door. The floor beneath the table was parquet, laid in a herringbone, and it had a carpet over the center of it that stopped a foot short of the walls all the way round. You could hear the difference underfoot when you crossed from one to the other. Carpet, then a board, then carpet again. The plates went first. They came off the table in stacks of no more than 5. 6 is where a stack starts to slide. They went onto a tray. The tray went out the service door and along the back passage to the scullery stair. The passage had a coconut runner down the middle of it. It took the sound, and it kept the men's shoes from marking the floor. They came off warm. That is a thing people do not think about. A plate that has held food and sat under candles for an hour holds a surprising amount of heat, and a stack of 5 of them was warm right through against the forearm as it was carried. Then the glasses. There were 4 glasses at each place. It sounds like a great many now. It was ordinary then. They were thin. That is the thing people forget about the glass of that period. It was blown so fine that a strong hand could break a stem by holding it wrong. In her first week, the housemaid had been shown how to hold a glass by the bowl, never by the stem. She had been shown how to set 6 of them upright in a lined basket so that they never touched. She did it now without thinking about it. Bowl, lift, lower, next. There were 16 candles in the 2 candelabra on the table, and they had burned down by perhaps a third over the course of the evening. The wax had run in a few places and set again in thin ridges down the outside of the stems. Those ridges would be picked off in the morning with a thumbnail, cold, which is the only way it works. Warm wax smears. Cold wax comes away clean in a single curl. The silver went last, and the silver was counted. This was not suspicion, whatever it may look like from a distance. It was bookkeeping. A house of that kind held a great deal of silver. Silver is heavy and easily mislaid. A fork that slips off a tray and into a laundry basket will be gone for a year. So it was counted out before a dinner and counted back after it. The numbers were written in a book kept in the pantry. If they did not agree, the whole thing was done again before anyone went to bed. Tonight they agreed. The under-butler ran his finger down the column, made a small mark at the bottom, and closed the book. The book itself was a plain ledger with a marbled cover, and it was kept in the pantry drawer with the pencil tied to it by a length of string, because a pencil that is not tied to a ledger is a pencil that is somewhere else when you want it. Then the cloth. A damask cloth for a table that size was an enormous object. It came off in 2 people's arms. It went over a wooden rail in the linen room to be looked at in the morning. Wine leaves a mark that must be treated while it is fresh. The housemaid found 2. She folded a corner of the cloth over each one, so the laundress would not have to hunt for them. That is a small kindness nobody would ever hear about. Most kindness in that house was of exactly that kind. The linen room was down the passage and up 4 steps, and it was the driest room in the house on purpose. It held presses of sheets and cloths and napkins. All of it folded the same way, all of it laid in the same direction, with a sprig of dried lavender between the layers in the summer presses. You could smell that room from the doorway. Under the cloth there was a felt underlay, and under the felt there was the table itself. And this is where the room became beautiful, though none of the 3 of them would have used that word. The mahogany had been polished for years by hand. Every house kept the recipe a little differently. Bees, turpentine, sometimes a little linseed. It had been rubbed along the grain by generations of forearms. What that produced over decades was not a shine exactly. It was a depth. You could look into that table the way you look into still water. There is something below the surface, and you cannot say what. The maid stood at the end of it with a soft cloth. She went along the top once lightly. It lifted the marks their hands had left while clearing. She went with the grain, always. Across the grain leaves marks that show under candlelight from the far end of the room, and somebody had told her that in her first month, and she had never once forgotten it. The lamp on the sideboard reflected in the wood as a long, soft smear of gold. She looked at it. It was there, and she was tired, and it was a pleasant thing to look at. Then she moved down the table, and the smear moved with her, and she went on. There was a moment near the end of that pass when she caught her own face in the wood, not clearly. A shape and the pale oval of it, moving when she moved. She did not look at it for long. One of the footmen went out with a tray and came back without it, and that was the rhythm of the whole hour. The room emptied by degrees. The chairs were pushed back in, each one squared to the table's edge. It took longer than anyone would guess. A chair that is nearly square looks worse than a chair that is plainly crooked. The sideboard was wiped. The decanters were stoppered and taken down for the morning. The fire in the grate had been let go out during the meal, on purpose. A room full of people and candles needs no fire. Now the room was cooling fast. The decanters were in operation of their own. Each one was stoppered with its own stopper, because a stopper ground to one decanter will not sit properly in another, and a stopper forced into the wrong neck is a chipped decanter. They were carried out 2 at a time, one in each hand, upright, at arm's length from the body. What was left in them would be dealt with in the morning by the butler, who kept his own accounting of it and did not discuss the matter with anyone. There was a serving table against the wall by the service doors, and on it a small brass bell that had not been rung that evening because nobody had needed to ring it. A well-run dining room does not use its bell. Everything arrives before it is asked for. The last thing was the candles. Not the ones on the table. Those were done. The wall sconces. There were 6 of them, each holding a candle in a glass shade. Each had to be snuffed. Each shade was lifted off and set on the sideboard so the smoke would not blacken it overnight. One of the footmen did this, working around the room. As each one went out, the room grew a little smaller. That is what a room does when you take light out of it. By the 4th, the far corners had gone. By the 6th, there was only the lamp on the sideboard, and the shape of the table lying in the dark like something asleep. Candle smoke has a smell that lasts about a minute in a large room and then goes. It is not unpleasant. It is one of the smells that has almost entirely left the modern world, along with the smell of a lamp being turned out and the smell of a horse in a street. That room had all 3 of them in it every night for years. He picked up the lamp. For a moment before he went, he stood in the doorway and looked back. It is not that he was thinking anything in particular. He had cleared that room a great many times, but there is something about a large room that has just been full and is now empty. Anyone who has locked up a place at the end of a night knows the feeling. It does not matter what century. The young one, the maid, said something to him at the door. Something about how strange it looked with nobody in it. He was not much older than she was, but he had been in service 4 years longer. In that world, it was a great deal. It looks the same in the morning, he said. Somebody will lay it again before 8. Then he went out ahead of her with the lamp. That is the whole of it, really. It gets used, and then it gets put back. It was doing that before either of us came here. She thought about that for a moment and decided it was probably true, and she was too tired to decide anything else about it. She looked back once from the doorway at the long shape of the table, with the lamp gone from it, and then she did not look again. She followed him out and pulled the door to behind her. The dining room stood empty in the dark. Its table was squared and its chairs were in. Its cloth was already over a rail in the linen room, waiting for morning. Down the back passage, the plates were going into water in the scullery. The glasses were coming out of their basket, one at a time. The silver lay in its baize-lined drawers, with the book closed on top of it. In the linen room, the cloth hung over its rail, with 2 corners folded in. Above, on the family floor, a lamp burned low in a niche with a mirror behind it. Outside the shuttered windows at the back of the house, there was a narrow yard nobody looked at. The snow was filling the corners between its steps. The room would be ready by 8. It always was. For now it rested, and so did the people who had emptied it. Scene 4. The man in the cellar. Let us go down now, below the level of the street. There were 2 floors under that house. The first held the kitchens, the scullery, the servants' hall, the larders, and the wine. The second held the furnace. You reached it by a plain stair with an iron rail. Every other stair in that house was carpeted. This one's was not. There was no need. Nobody came down it who was not going to work. The air changed as you descended. Above, the house smelled of wax and cold stone. Down here it smelled of coal dust and warm iron, and something faintly like burnt bread. The stair turned once, halfway down. There was a small, square window in the turn. It looked out into a light well at the level of the pavement above. In daylight, it gave a gray square of sky. At night, it gave nothing. The furnace room was low and wide. The ceiling was crossed with pipes. They came out of the top of the boiler in a great bundle and went off in every direction, and each one carried heat to a different part of the house above. They were lagged in a wrapping that had been white when it was new. It was now the color of weak tea. Here and there it had been repaired with cloth and string by somebody's hand rather than replaced. That was the new arrangement. Central heat. It had come into the great houses of the city not long before, and it had changed how people lived in winter more than almost anything else of that time. Before it, a house was heated room by room, fire by fire. Every grate needed coal carried up. Every grate made ash to be carried down. A maid rose in the dark and laid and lit a dozen of them before the family woke. Consider what that meant for a moment in a house with a great many rooms. It meant a young girl going into a cold room before 6 with a box of brushes and cloths. She knelt on a cloth so as not to mark the carpet. She raked yesterday's ash into a bucket. She black-leaded the grate. She laid paper and wood and coal in the correct order and lit it. Then she rose and carried the bucket and went to the next one, a dozen times before breakfast. In the dark, in winter, with cold hands. The pipes did away with all of that. It is one of the very few machines of that period that made life easier at the bottom of a house rather than at the top. It did so entirely by accident. Now there was one fire, and it was here, and one man kept it. He was in his 40s. He had come to the city from a farm, and before the farm his family had been in the coal country, so he had known the smell of it all his life. He wore no livery. Nobody upstairs would have recognized him. He wore a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled past the elbow. Over it, a leather apron that had been someone else's before it was his. His hands were black at the knuckles. They would stay that way through any amount of washing. That is simply what coal does to a hand over years. He sat on a wooden stool near the boiler door with a lamp on a hook beside him. The stool had been worn smooth in the middle. It was the only comfortable object in the room. Beside the stool, there was a shovel, a rake, a poker, as long as his arm, and a bucket. Those 4 objects were the whole of the equipment. Each one had a place on the floor that it went back to. A man who has to hunt for a poker in a dim cellar at 3 in the morning will eventually put his hand somewhere he should not. His work was simple to describe and hard to do well. The fire had to be kept even, not hot even. That is the whole art of it. A furnace burning too hot wastes coal and cracks its own grate. A furnace burning too low lets the pipes cool. When the pipes cool, the rooms above cool, and someone upstairs wakes in the small hours, feeling cold and does not know why. It is not a blaze that he built. He built a bed. The coal went on in shovelfuls, spread across the grate rather than heaped in the middle. He worked to the corners first, because the corners cool first, and a fire that dies at its edges will pull in on itself and go out from the outside in. The shovel went in low and came out with the coal riding flat. He had a way of turning his wrist at the last moment. It spread the load across the width of the grate instead of dropping it in a heap. That cannot be taught in words. It takes about a year to acquire. The coal itself was hard. It broke rather than crumbled. The pieces were the size of a fist or smaller. Then he closed the door and adjusted the draft. There was a damper on the flue and a slide on the ash door, and between the two of them, a man who knew what he was doing could hold a fire at almost exactly the temperature he wanted for hours at a stretch. He had learned it from a man who had learned it from another man. None of the three of them could have written a word of it down. He knew what he was doing. He could tell the state of that fire from the sound alone. A fire drawing well has a low, steady breath to it, almost below hearing. A fire drawing too hard has a thin note in it, like wind at a window. He listened for that note without meaning to, the way a man listens for his own name. There was a small glass panel, low in the boiler door, no bigger than a playing card. Through it, you could see the fire. He did not look through it often. It told him less than listening did. Every so often, he got up and went to the gauge. It was a round brass face on the front of the boiler, with a needle, and the needle was meant to sit in a particular part of its arc. It sat there. It had sat there most of the evening. He tapped the glass anyway, with his knuckle, once, which does nothing at all, and which every man who has ever watched a gauge has always done. Then he sat down again. Then he did what he always did next, which was to look at nothing in particular for a while. The coals was in a bin at the back of the room, under a chute that came in from the yard. Once or twice a week, a wagon stopped in the street above, and the coal came down that chute in a long roar that shook the plates in the scullery 2 rooms away. It was the loudest thing that happened in the house all week. The bin was nearly full tonight, which was a comfort. A man who keeps a fire measures his peace of mind in how much fuel is behind him. There was a fine black dust over everything in that room. It was on the walls and in the corners. It lay along the tops of the pipes where nobody would ever wipe it. It had been settling there since the house was built. It got into his clothes and into the seams of his hands. It got into bread if he brought bread down with him. That is why he did not. He shoveled at intervals, and between the intervals he did very little. This is worth sitting with, because it is unlike most of the work in that house. The maid upstairs was busy every minute of her shift. The kitchen was busy. The pantry was busy. Down here, there was a fire that wanted feeding 4 or 5 times in a night. And between those times, there was a man on a stool with a lamp. It is not a shift most people could keep. The waiting is the difficult part, and the waiting is nearly all of it. He had a newspaper. Some nights, if one came down from the hall, he could read, though not quickly. He had a tin cup of tea that went cold, and he drank it cold. Mostly he sat, and he listened to the fire, and he watched the small red line at the bottom of the boiler door where the light got out. Some men could not stand it. The house had gone through 3 of them in as many years before he came. It does not suit everybody, a room like that. He did not mind it at all. He had a way of sitting that took the weight off one hip and then the other. He never thought about it. He could stay on that stool an hour and shift no more than twice. He had spent his childhood in fields with nobody to talk to for whole afternoons, and a room with a fire in it and a roof over it seemed to him a very fair arrangement. Around midnight, the house above him went fully to sleep. He could feel it happen in a way he would have found hard to explain. The pipes made a sound when a radiator upstairs finished settling. Water moved in them, and the movement traveled down, and it arrived in the cellar as a series of small taps and knocks that came in a slow order. It came up through the iron in the floor above him as much as through the air. He knew the order. He knew which room was which. The third floor first always, then the corridor on the second, then, last, the small sitting room at the front, when whoever was in it finally went up. Tonight, the front room went quiet later than usual. He noted it. He put on another shovel because a room in use is a room that wants heat, and then he sat back down. There was an old man he thought of sometimes, from the coal country, who had worked underground and come up at the end of it with a bad chest and a good temper. That man had told him something once, years before, when he was still a boy and complaining about a task. Everything anyone does in a house, he said, is somebody keeping something from going out. Then, after a while, because he had a way of adding to things, the fire, the light, the bread, the child, all of it is the same job. You just keep it from going out. Nobody sees you do it right. The younger man had not understood it then. He understood it now, sitting under a house with 100 rooms, holding a needle in the middle of a brass dial while everyone above him slept. The lamp beside him needed no attention. Somebody in the pantry had filled it that morning. It would burn until 6 without complaint. In 9 years, he had never had one go out on him down there. There was a thermometer on a bracket near the pipes, and he had learned to distrust it within a month of arriving, because it read 3 degrees high, and nobody had ever adjusted it, and everyone had simply agreed to subtract. He shoveled again near 2. He raked the ash forward and let it fall through into the pan, and the pan he would empty before the morning man came at 6. The ash went into a bin in the yard and was carted away, and some of it went out to be spread on the icy steps of the house, because ash on ice is the oldest remedy there is. There was a habit of thrift in those cellars that people no longer expect. Nothing there was wasted. It is not what anyone imagines about a house of that kind. The ash pan came out on a handle, and it was heavier than it looked. He carried it low at the knee. Ash carried at the waist blows back into the face of the man carrying it. There is no dignity in that at all. The rake went back against the wall in its place, and the shovel beside it, and the poker at the end where the poker went. He wiped his hands on a cloth kept on a nail. The lamp on its hook made a circle on the floor about the size of a dinner plate. Beyond it, the pipes went off into the dark in their bundle, carrying warmth up through the walls to rooms he had never seen and never would. Far above him, under a quilt, in a room with a marble fireplace that no longer held a fire, someone turned over in their sleep and did not wake because the room was warm. They would never know why. That was the arrangement, and it suited everyone. He put a last shovel on the bed of coal, spread to the corners, and closed the iron door. He sat down on the stool and put his hands on his knees and listened to the draw of it. The needle held where it belonged. He would open that door twice more before 6, and both times he would find the fire exactly where he had left it. The fire breathed, low and even, and the house above it slept. Scene 5, the hour of pins. Let us go up again, to the floor where the bedrooms were. There was, perhaps, a woman in that house whose whole working day ended in another woman's room, an hour after everyone else had finished. She was a lady's maid. Picture her at the end of that evening with a candle already lit on the dressing table and a fire dying in the grate. The room was large and it was warm. The curtains had been drawn hours before by somebody else. The bed had been turned down an hour before. The housemaid who did it was already asleep at the top of the house. The corner of the sheet was folded back at an angle, the same angle every night. A stone hot water bottle in a knitted cover lay near the foot of it, under the blankets. That bottle had gone in warm. By morning it would be cool. It would be taken out and emptied and hung upside down on a hook in the linen room to dry. On the dressing table, there was a shallow velvet tray lined with velvet, and the tray was empty, and it was about to stop being empty. The room had a smell that belonged entirely to itself. Beeswax from the furniture, coal smoke from the grate, lavender water, and the faint dry sweetness of the wardrobe when its door had been open. The first thing was the hair. It is not easy now to imagine how much structure went into a head of hair on an evening like that one. It was not simply pinned, it was built. There was a foundation of the woman's own hair, and over it a shape, and the shape was held together by pins, and the pins ran to some considerable number. Not 10, not 20. Enough that they were counted out of a small china dish at the beginning of the evening and counted back into it at the end, because a pin left in a hairbrush or dropped in a carpet is a pin that finds a bare foot at some point in the following week. There was a looking glass on the dressing table, hinged so that it could be tilted. On either side of it stood a candle in a small holder. 2 candles, not one. A single candle throws a shadow across half a face. It makes the work slower. So the maid stood behind the chair and began. She worked from the back and from the bottom, which is the only way that does not pull. Her fingers went in flat against the scalp, found the head of a pin, and drew it out along the line it had gone in. Each one came out with a small sound, not quite a click, something softer. She worked with her wrists rather than her fingers, which is the trick of it. Fingers pull, a wrist lifts. She laid them in the china dish one by one, and after a while, the dish had a small heap in it. And the heap shifted and settled as each new pin landed. The shape of the hair came down in stages. That is the part that surprises people who have never seen it done. It does not fall all at once. A section releases and hangs, and the rest holds. Then another. The whole structure comes apart by degrees, like something being unbuilt rather than undone. There was a comb on the table too, tortoise shell, with several teeth missing at one end. It had been broken years before and kept anyway. A comb with 3 teeth gone still combs. Nobody replaces a thing that works. Neither woman spoke much during this. There was talk in that room on some nights, and there was silence on others. And the maid had learned within a month which kind of evening she was in before she had taken out the first 4 pins. Tonight was a quiet one. The fire in the grate had been let go down on purpose over the evening. The room would be warm rather than hot at the hour of sleeping. A hot room and a cold one are equally bad for it. Every housemaid in that city knew that as a matter of trade. When the hair was down, she took up the brush. It was a boar bristle brush with a wooden back, and it had been in use long enough that the bristles had gone soft at the ends and worked better than a new one would have. 100 strokes was the old rule. Whether anyone ever counted honestly is another matter. What is true is that it went on a good while. It was done without hurry. The rhythm of it was almost the same in every house in that city on that night, and had been so for many years before. The brush went from the crown down to the ends, then again, then again. You could hear it in the room if you were standing there. A soft, dry, regular sound with a pause at the end of each stroke. It is one of the few sounds from that world that has not changed at all. 50 strokes in, the hair began to change. It went from the dulled, worked, pinned condition of a whole evening back to something that moved when the head moved. That is what the brushing is for. It is why it takes as many strokes as it does. There was a small silver dish on the table for the pins that were not hairpins, the ones that held a collar or a fold, and they went in there separately, because mixing the two makes a muddle that somebody has to sort in daylight. Then the jewelry. The pieces came off in a fixed order because there was a fixed order for putting them on, and the reverse of a habit is easier to keep than a new habit. Earrings first, then the bracelet, then the necklace, which took 2 hands and a moment of attention because the clasp was small. Each piece went into its own place in a fitted case lined with dark blue velvet. The case had shaped recesses. There was one for each thing, cut to fit, and a piece put back in the wrong recess would not sit flat, and the lid would not close properly, and so nothing was ever put in the wrong recess. The maid closed the lid and turned the small key. The case itself lived in a drawer that was not locked. The door of the room was not locked either. The front door of the house had been bolted, and a man was walking the pavement outside. That was the whole of the security. It was considered entirely sufficient. Then the dress. This was the slowest part, and this is where the modern imagination usually goes wrong. It was not one garment. It was a system of them, and they came off in reverse order of how they went on, and several of them fastened at the back where the wearer could not reach. That is the plain answer to a question people often ask about that period. A woman in that room could not have undressed alone in any reasonable stretch of the evening. The clothes were not built for it. The clothes assumed another pair of hands. There were hooks and eyes. There were tapes. In one place, there was a short line of small buttons fastened with a hook because fingers could not manage them. So there were hooks to be worked down a back seam one by one. There were laces to be eased, not pulled. There were tapes to be untied. The maid worked steadily. She had done this for years, and her hands went where they were going without being told. She worked from the top down and from the outside in. That is the order everything comes off in every century, whatever the clothes are made of. Each thing that came off was not put down. It was hung or folded or laid over the arm of a chair to be dealt with in the morning. Silk creases if you leave it in a heap, and a crease pressed in overnight is a morning's work for somebody. The room filled, little by little, with the shapes of the evening. A dress over a stand, gloves flat on the table, shoes side by side under the chair. The stays came off last of the shaped things. They were set over the back of a chair rather than folded. Folding puts a crease into the boning that will not come out. At last, there was a nightgown and a wrapper, and the woman in the chair was simply a person in a warm room again. She said something then. Something ordinary about the snow and about the morning. About morning, and whether the carriage would be needed early. The maid answered. That was the whole conversation, and neither of them thought about it afterward. There is a particular quality to a conversation between two people who see each other every day at the same hour. They are not friends. They are not strangers either. It has no beginning and no end. It simply resumes. She banked the fire, which meant covering the embers with ash so that they would hold their heat and could be revived quickly. She checked the water jug on the washstand. She set the candle where it could be reached. She looked once at the window where the frost had started on the inside of the lower pane. She set the fire screen where it belonged. She looked at the candle by the bed and judged there was enough of it. There was. She took up the china dish from the dressing table, which was the last thing she did in that room every night of the year. Then she went out and closed the door. In the corridor, she stood for a moment with the china dish of pins in her hand, which is a small and rather funny thing to be holding at the end of a full day. She would sort them in the morning. There would be one missing, probably. There usually was. It would turn up in the carpet within the week, and she would find it with her foot, and that is how it had always gone. The corridor was carpeted, and it took her footsteps entirely. One lamp burned in a niche, halfway down, with a mirror behind it. She passed through its light and out of it again in about 4 paces. The dish was cold china, and it sat in her palm, the way it had sat in her palm every night for years. She went along the corridor toward the back stairs. There was an older woman in that house, the housekeeper, who had been in service most of her life and had been a lady's maid herself once in another city. They had talked about it once, sitting in the housekeeper's room with the accounts open between them. The younger woman had said something about the strangeness of it, about being the last person awake in a room, doing the smallest possible things, taking a day apart piece by piece. The old woman had thought about that for a while. Somebody undoes the day, she said. In every house there is, and there always was. In a farmhouse, it is the woman herself. Here it is you. And then, in the way that older people close a subject, the day does not put itself away. Somebody has to. Then everybody sleeps. That conversation had been years ago. The accounts had been open on the table between them. Neither of them ever mentioned it again. The maid went up the back stairs to her own room, which was small and near the roof and much colder than the room she had left. She undid her own hair, which took no time at all, and she did it in the dark to save the candle. Below her, the house was dark on 3 floors. Outside, on the avenue, the snow had reached the tops of the iron rails. The pins were in a dish on a dressing table, waiting for morning. The day had been put away. Scene 6, the man on the avenue. Let us step outside the house for a while. The front door was bolted. The area gate at the bottom of the steps was chained. Nobody in that building would open either of them again until morning. But the street was not empty. There was a man walking it. He was not employed by the house. He was employed by the block, in a manner of speaking. Several of the families along that stretch paid into an arrangement. The arrangement produced a man in a heavy coat. He walked from one end of it to the other and back again. All night, every night, in whatever the weather was doing. The arrangement was old, and it worked. A man alone on a dark street is a deterrent to almost nothing. A man alone on a dark street who is known to be there every night at intervals of about 20 minutes is a deterrent to a very great deal. Tonight the weather was snow. It had been falling since the middle of the afternoon. It had not stopped. It had not turned to sleet either. which was the mercy of it. Wet snow soaks a coat through in an hour. Dry snow sits on the wool. You can knock it off with a hand. This was dry snow. It sat on his shoulders in a thin, even layer. Every so often he brushed it away without noticing that he had. He wore a greatcoat that reached below his knees. Under it, 2 shirts and a knitted waistcoat. Over his boots, a pair of galoshes. He had bought them himself and considered it the best money he ever spent. On his head, a hard hat with a brim. A brim keeps snow out of your collar better than anything else. In his pocket, he had a rattle, which was a wooden thing on a handle that made a noise out of all proportion to its size. He had used it twice in 11 years. Both times it had been for a fire and not for a person. He carried a lantern, though he did not need it for seeing. The gas lamps did that job. They stood at their measured intervals down the avenue. Each one made a cone of soft yellow. It reached the ground in a circle about the width of a room. Between the circles, the street went blue and quiet. The lantern was for being seen. That is the part that gets left out. A watchman's light was not for looking. It was so that anyone at a window could look down at any hour. They would see a small light going steadily along. Then they could stop wondering and go back to sleep. The lamps themselves were worth looking at if you had the leisure for it. Each one stood on a fluted iron column with a small ladder rest near the top, and above that a glass box with a peaked cap, and inside the box a mantle that burned with a soft, steady light. In wind they moved. In snow they did not. He walked slowly. There is no reason for a watchman to walk quickly. There are several reasons not to. A slow pace covers the same ground in a night. It keeps you from sweating inside a heavy coat. Sweat is the thing that makes a man cold 3 hours later, and a slow pace means you hear. His pace was about 2 miles in an hour, which sounds like nothing and is exactly right. At that pace, a man can cover a block, check the doors of every house on it, and be back at the corner in the time it takes to think about very little. He listened as he went, without concentrating on it. The snow made most of the listening easy. It takes sound out of a street the way a carpet takes it out of a corridor. What was left was very small, his own footfalls with their particular crunch and squeak. The snow was cold and dry, and that is the sound it makes. The faint hiss of gas when he passed under a lamp. Nothing else at all. Sound behaves oddly in falling snow. A noise from close by arrives muffled, and a noise from far off arrives clearer than it should. And a man who works nights in winter learns to distrust his own judgment about distance. There was a hydrant on that corner, and it had been dug out of the snow by somebody during the afternoon, which was the sort of small civic act that happened without anybody arranging it. At the station, as he always did, and looked down the cross street toward the park. The trees stood in there in their bare rows. They were black against a sky, gone pale, the way a snowing sky does at night, It is not dark, that sky. It holds the light of the city underneath it and throws it back down. Everything below has a faint glow that comes from nowhere in particular. He liked that corner. He had liked it for years. Then he turned and went back the way he had come. His route was a simple one. He covered it many times in a night. He knew every part of it the way a man knows a road walked since childhood. He knew which house had the loose grating that rattled in a wind. He knew which had the dog that woke for footsteps and which had the dog that did not. The third house from the corner had a laundry window left ajar in every season. The family there had been told about it twice. They went on leaving it ajar anyway. He knew which railings had a gap where a boy could get through, and he knew that no boy had tried it in years. He knew the coal chutes and which of their covers sat loose. He knew where the ice formed first on that block, at the low point by the third house, and he had put ash on it himself more than once out of a bucket left at the area gate. He knew the servants by sight, most of them, from the area steps at odd hours. He did not know the families at all. It is worth saying plainly, from the outside it looks as though a man who walks the same houses for years would come to know who lives in them. He did not. He knew doors and windows and gates and the habits of the staff. The people upstairs were a rumor to him. He was less than that to them. At about 1 o'clock, he came past the corner house with the carved stone. Its windows were dark, except for one, high up. A lamp had been left burning on a landing. He noted it, as he noted everything, and thought nothing about it. That same lamp had been burning on that landing every night since he first walked the street. The snow on the steps of that house was untouched. Good sign. Nobody had gone in or out for hours. The steps themselves went up in a shallow curve to the front door, and there was a boot scraper set into the stone at the bottom of them, a small iron between two uprights. Nobody had used it that night. It stood under an inch of snow with a clean white cap on it. He checked the area gate at the bottom of the steps. He put his hand on the chain. It is a thing you do by feel and not by looking. The chain was cold and it was fast. He moved on. He went on down the block, past the house with the loose grating, past the one with the laundry window. Halfway down the block, a small thing happened that was the most interesting thing to happen all night. A cat came out from under the steps of a house and crossed in front of him, unhurried. It stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. It shook each of its back feet in turn, which cats do in snow. It is very funny to watch if you have nothing else to look at. Then it went under another set of steps and did not come out. He walked on. He was smiling a little. There was nobody to see it. He had a place at the end of the block where he stood out of the wind. It was a deep doorway with a stone hood over it. If the snow was coming straight down, that doorway stayed dry. He had found that doorway in his first winter, and he had never told anybody else about it. which was not selfishness so much as the ordinary secrecy of a man who works alone. He stood in it now and took out a small flask of tea and drank some. It was still warm, barely. He thought about his own house. It was far to the east and smaller than any of the ones he was watching. His wife would be asleep. The stove would be banked. There would be a bed with 2 blankets on it, and his side of it empty until morning. He would get into that bed as she was getting out of it. That was how they had lived for years. They had both stopped finding it strange. Nothing in the whole of that night would be written down anywhere. There was no books to sign, no round to record, no one to report to at the end of it. He simply walked, and at 7 in the morning he went home. There was an older man who had walked this same stretch before him. He had trained him on it in the first weeks, when everything about the night still felt wrong. The younger man had asked him once what you were supposed to do about the boredom of it. The old man had walked another 20 paces before answering, which was his habit. "You are not here to do anything," he said. "You are here so that nothing has to be done." And then, because it needed the second part, if a night goes by and you have not done one single thing, that is the night working exactly as it should. Learn to like that. Most men cannot. The younger man had not liked it for about a year. He had liked it ever since. The cold had got into his feet by then, which it did every night at about the same hour. And the remedy was to walk faster for a block and then go back to the proper pace. He finished the tea and put the flask away and stepped out of the doorway. The snow had filled his footprints from the last pass. That happened perhaps 3 times in a heavy night. There was something in it he had never been able to name. You walk a street and come back and find it made new, over and over, with nobody doing anything. He shifted the lantern to the other hand, which he did about every 10 minutes without ever deciding to. He started back up the avenue. The gas lamps stood in their line ahead of him, each one holding its circle. The circles got smaller and closer together toward the far end. At last, they ran into one another and became a single soft haze. Behind every dark window, there were people asleep. Under the pavement, there were cellars with fires in them. Above the roofs, the snow kept coming down, out of a sky that gave no sign of stopping. His lantern moved along, low and steady, in front of all of it. If anyone had looked out at that hour, they would have seen it pass. Nobody looked. There were 4 hours of it left, and he knew exactly how they would go. The same block, the same doors, the same corner, the same chain, cold under the same hand. He went on to the corner and turned and came back. The kitchen before dawn. There is another corner of that night worth visiting, and it is warm. Come back inside, and down the back stairs, and along the passage past the servants' hall. The kitchen is at the end of it. It was a large room with a stone floor and a high ceiling. The ceiling was high on purpose. It carried the heat up and away from the people working underneath it. The floor was flagstone, laid in large slabs, and it had been scrubbed that evening with a brush and a bucket. It dried in patches, dark where the water still sat in the low places, pale where it had gone. By morning, it would be uniform again. Along one wall stood the range. It was a great black iron thing built into the chimney breast. Hobs ran across the top, with 2 ovens set into the side, and a rail along the front where cloths were hung to dry. It had been black-leaded that morning, as it was every morning. It gave back the light of the room in a low, dull sheen. Opposite it stood the dresser, which ran nearly the length of the wall, with plates standing on edge along its and hooks underneath for jugs. Every plate faced the same way. Nobody had ever given an order about that. It was simply how a dresser is stacked in that kitchen and in every other. That range had not gone out. Not tonight, not last night, not for years. This is one of the things forgotten most completely about a house of that period. A kitchen range was not lit each morning like a campfire. It was kept. It burned every hour of every day, all year. Letting it go out was a small disaster. It cost half a day to put right. It was also the reason the kitchen was the warmest room in the building at every hour of the day and night, and the reason the cat slept under it, and the reason the servants' hall next door was a tolerable place to sit in January. So at the end of the evening, the cook had banked it. She had raked the fire together. She had laid a covering of small coal and ash over the top of it. She had closed the dampers down almost to nothing. Under all that the fire went to sleep, it did not go out. It sat there through the empty hours, red at the center, doing nothing but waiting for someone to come back. The kitchen at 3 in the morning was one of the finest rooms in that house, and nobody was in it. It was warm. Everywhere else in the building, the walls were giving their heat back to the night. Here, the stone floor near the range held the whole of the day's warmth. It would hold it until morning. On the rail, across the front of the range, there were 2 cloths hanging, and they were dry now, and they had the stiffness that cloths get when they dry near heat. The copper hung on the wall in its row. Pans hung in descending sizes, each one on its own hook, from the great stock pot down to the smallest saucepan. Each had been scoured that evening with sand and a cut lemon, then rubbed dry. Copper goes dull in a night if it is left damp. Dull copper in a kitchen is a reproach. No cook in that city would have allowed it. The table was deal, unvarnished, and it had been scrubbed so many thousands of times that the grain stood proud of the surface, and you could feel it under a palm. It was pale, almost white in places, and there were 2 dark patches near one end where something had been set down hot years ago by somebody nobody remembered. On the long, scrubbed table in the middle of the room, there was a cloth over something. under the cloth was dough. It had been mixed the evening before and set near the range. It stood at the far end, where the warmth reaches but does not cook. It had been rising there for hours in the dark. By now it had come to the top of its bowl and gone a little slack at the surface. There is no sound a dough makes while it rises. But if you had put your hand flat on that cloth, you would have found it warmer than the table underneath. Around the room in the dark, there were the other things a kitchen holds. A stone sink with a wooden draining board. A pump handle at one end of it, because the house had piped water and the kitchen had kept the pump anyway. Crocks along a shelf with flour and sugar and salt, each with its own wooden scoop inside. A pestle and mortar, a row of knives on a rack, blades down. There was a bellboard high on the wall of the passage, just outside the kitchen door. A row of small bells on coiled springs, each one lettered underneath with the name of a room: drawing room, library, dining room, and the bedrooms along the bottom. At that hour it was motionless. Not one of those bells had moved since 11. It is not a thing anyone would recognize now. It is the whole architecture of that household in one piece of painted wood. Every room that could ask, and no way for anybody down here to ask back. A little after 4, someone came down. She was the kitchen maid, and she came down in a shawl over her dress, with her hair not yet properly pinned. She had gone to bed a little before 11, and had been asleep within a minute of lying down, which is the one great mercy of that kind of work. She lit a candle at the passage lamp and carried it in. The first thing was the fire. She took the poker and opened the dampers. She broke through the ash crust on top of the banked coal. Underneath it, the fire was exactly where it had been left. A deep, dull red, low down in the grate, holding. She spread it and fed it. Within a few minutes, the range began to take on heat again. There was that small ticking sound iron makes as it warms. The poker was warm at the handle end when she picked it up, because it had been leaning against the range all night. And that is a small pleasure at 4 in the morning that nobody has ever written a word about. Then she filled the kettle at the stone sink and set it on the hob. It is the first thing anyone does in a kitchen at that hour in any century. You put the water on. The kettle was iron, and it held a good deal, and it took a while, and she did other things while it went. While it came up, she opened the shutters. Beyond the window, there was a light well. Above the light well, a rectangle of pale sky. Snow came down through it in slow, drifting lines. It was nowhere near morning. It was the part of the night that pretends to be morning. It does that because you are the only one awake. She stood there for a moment with her hands on the sill. That is not laziness. Anyone who has opened a building before dawn knows that minute at the window. It does not last. It is somehow the best minute of the day. Then she got on with it. The flour came out of its crock with the wooden scoop and went onto the table in a small drift, and she spread it with the side of her hand. The dough came out of its bowl onto the floured table. She knocked it back with the heel of her hand. It is a satisfying thing to do, and it looks rougher than it is. Then she divided it and shaped it and set the pieces into their tins. Bread for that house was not a small matter. There was the loaf for upstairs. There was a very much larger quantity for downstairs. A house of that size fed its whole staff 3 times a day. Most of what they ate was bread. She worked without hurry. Bread cannot be hurried. A kitchen maid who tries learns that within a week. The tins were black iron and heavy, and they had been greased that evening. They had been in use so long that the corners had gone rounded, and the surfaces had taken on the dull polish that only comes from years of bread. The proving was the part that could not be rushed and could not be judged by a clock. You pressed a knuckle into the top of the dough and watched what it did. If the dent stayed, it had gone too far. If it sprang back at once, it wanted more. Somewhere between the two, the dent came halfway back and stopped, and that was the moment. The tins went near the range to prove a second time. She swept the floor while she waited. She filled the coal scuttle. She set out the trays for the early tea. Those went up to the housekeeper and the butler. The trays for upstairs came later. She wiped the table down and put the flour crock back. She stood the scoop upright in it, handle out, the way it was always left. She set the kettle back on the hob after filling the pot, because a kettle off the heat in that kitchen was a small waste, and everybody there had been raised to notice it. The cook came down at 5. She was a heavy, slow-moving woman who had been in kitchens since she was a girl. She had learned not to say very much before her first cup of tea. She looked at the fire. She looked at the tins. She nodded once. That was the whole of the review. Then she poured out 2 cups. She pushed one across the table. She sat down on the corner of the bench. The tea was strong, and it was drunk without much ceremony from thick cups that did not match the ones upstairs and were never meant to. They drank in silence for a while. There was a thing the cook said sometimes in that hour, and she said it that morning, more or less by habit. Nothing up there works if this room does not. And then, looking at the range, fire, water, bread, everything else in the house is decoration. The kitchen maid had heard it 12 times and would hear it 100 more. Only, years later, in a kitchen of her own, did she understand that it was true. There was a way of judging the oven that had nothing to do with any instrument. You opened the door and put your arm in to the elbow and counted. If you could hold it to a certain count, the oven was right for bread. Fewer, and it was too hot and wanted the damper. More, and it wanted feeding. The cook did it that morning without up her too, and said nothing, which meant it was right. The ovens came up to heat. The tins went in, and the door was shut. Within 10 minutes, the room began to fill with the smell of it. It is the oldest good smell there is, and it had been filling kitchens like that one for longer than anyone could say. Upstairs, 4 floors up, everyone was asleep. The lamps in the corridor niches had burned down. The fire in the cellar was steady. The man on the avenue had turned at the corner. He was walking back with snow filling his prints behind him. Nobody up there knew that the bread was in. They would know it at breakfast, when it arrived warm and sliced on a plate. They would not think about it at all. That was the correct outcome. The cat came out from under the range and sat by the fender with its back to them, which is what it did every morning of its life. In the kitchen, the 2 women sat with their tea and watched the oven door, and neither of them said anything more. Outside, above the light well, the sky had not changed at all. The bread rose in the heat, slowly, the way it always had. Scene 8. The top of the house. There is one part of that house we have not entered yet. It was on the floor above the bedroom, at the back. The ceilings came down a little there, and the windows were smaller. In the plans, it was called the nursery. In practice, it was 3 rooms and a passage. It was almost a separate household. You went up to it by a short stair, with a gate at the bottom. The gate was a plain wooden thing, hinged to the wall. A carpenter had made it, and it was painted the color of the wainscot, so that it would not be noticed. It stayed closed. Everyone went over it, or through it, without a thought. That is what you do with a thing that has always been there. It was the only floor in the building where a rule was written on a wall. There was a card in a frame by the head of the stair, in a copperplate hand, listing the hours of the day and what happened in each of them. Breakfast, walk, dinner, rest, lessons, tea, bed. Nobody read it. It had been there for years, and it had gone the color of weak tea behind its glass. Above the gate, the character of the house changed. The carpets were plainer and more worn. The furniture was old, and it had come up from other rooms as it went out of fashion. It had been repainted rather than replaced. There was a table with a scarred top. There were chairs that did not match. It was, without anybody intending it, the most comfortable floor in the building. The 3 rooms were the day nursery at the front, the night nursery in the middle, and the nurse's room at the back. The day nursery had the better light. It had a low table and small chairs, and a cupboard with doors that did not quite shut. And inside that cupboard, everything a household accumulates for children over 2 generations. A wooden horse with most of its paint gone. A box of bricks. Books with the corners softened. There was a rocking horse in the corner, and at night, in the dark, it was a large dark shape with a suggestion of a head, and both children had been frightened of it at some point and had grown out of it. There was a fire guard rail across the day nursery window as well, at the level of a child's chest. and it had been there so long that the paint on it was thicker at the ends, where hands had held it. The night nursery was the middle room. There were 2 small beds in it and a cot. The walls had been papered years before in a pattern of small sprigs. The paper had faded unevenly. It was darker where the furniture stood against it. The beds were small and iron, painted white, with a bar at the head and the foot. The mattresses were flock. The sheets were plain and had been washed so often that they had gone soft in a way that new linen never is. Above one bed, there was a picture on the wall, hung low, at a child's height rather than an adult's. Somebody had thought about that at some point and hung it properly. A fire had burned in the grate that evening and was now down to embers behind a nursery guard. That guard is worth describing. It was the one piece of ironwork in the house made for a reason nobody else thought of. It was a frame of vertical bars with a mesh standing well out from the hearth and hooked to the wall on either side. Nothing could get past it. Nothing could be pulled over. It had been in the family a good while. It had already guarded 2 generations. There was also a fender of the same kind around the hearth itself, low with a padded top rail. That padding had been recovered twice. On the mantel above it stood a candle in a low holder, and the candle was not lit. The light in the room came instead from a small lamp on a shelf near the door, turned down as far as it would go without going out. That was the standing rule of the room: never dark, never bright. A wick turned too low will smoke and go out in the small hours. A wick turned even slightly too high will fill the room with a light that keeps a child half awake without either of them knowing why. There is a setting between the two, and finding it takes a few nights in any new room, and after that, you never think about it again. The nurse slept in the room next door, with the connecting door open a hand's width. She was not young. She was not young. She had been with the family since before the older child was born, and she would stay until the younger one went away to school. Then she would go to another family and begin again. That was the whole shape of the life. She had known it from the start. She had chosen it anyway. Her room was plain: a bed, a chair, a chest, a washstand, and a small looking glass hung too high because it had been hung for somebody taller. On the chest, there was a photograph in a frame and a hairbrush and nothing else. She had been in that room a long time by then. There is a particular kind of familiarity that comes from sleeping in the same small space for years without ever quite owning it. And she had it, and she had stopped noticing that she had it. She was awake now, though she had not meant to be. You wake in that job. You wake at sounds that are not sounds. A change in breathing on the other side of a door will do it. After enough years, the waking becomes automatic. It is largely useless. 9 times out of 10, there is nothing wrong at all. She lay for a moment and listened. You learn the 3 of them separately. They are not alike. One is quick and shallow. One is slower. One has a small catch in it that means nothing at all and that a stranger would sit up at. 3 sets of breathing, and all of them even. That was that. She could have gone back to sleep. She got up instead because she was awake, and because a person who has done a thing for 20 years does not lie in a warm bed wondering. She knew where the boards spoke in that room. There were 2, one near the door and one at the foot of the second bed, and she had known about both of them within a week of arriving and had not stepped on either since. The connecting door had been eased at the hinge with a little oil at some point in the past by somebody who understood exactly why that mattered. She went through in stocking feet. The room was warm. The embers behind the guard had gone the deep, soft red they go at the end, and a gray skin had come over them, the kind that breaks when you touch it. The room was very still. The only movement in it was the lamp flame, and that hardly counted. She went slowly along the room and looked at each bed in turn. The older child had thrown the covers off one arm, the way he did every night of his life, and she put them back. He did not stir. He would throw them off again within the hour. The younger one was turned to the wall with a fist near her mouth. The younger child had a rag doll in the bed, and the doll had worked its way down under the blankets, and she left it where it was because feeling for it in the dark is how you wake a child who is not awake. The cot she barely looked at. She listened to it instead, from the end of it, which tells you more. The room had that particular warmth that a room with sleeping children in it has, which is not only temperature, it is the air being used. It is a little closer, a little softer, and anyone who has stood in such a room will know it at once. Above the cot there was nothing on the wall, and that was on purpose. Nothing that could come down, nothing that a hand could reach. Then she stood in the middle of the room for a moment. The window was uncurtained at the top, above the shutters. Through that band of glass, she could see the falling snow. It caught what light there was and held it. The house below her was entirely quiet. She thought, as she often did at that hour, about the strangeness of her position. She had raised children who would not remember most of what she did, in a house that was not hers, and she would leave it one day with a small box of things. It is not a complaint, that thought. It was simply the thought that came at 3 in the morning, and she was used to it, and it passed. There had been an older woman in her first place, the head nurse there. That woman had said something to her when she was newly arrived and dreadfully homesick, and it had stayed with her ever since. She had been away from her own family a long time by then, and had not yet learned that she would be away from them for good. She never forgot it. She understood it differently at different ages. They will not remember you, the woman said. They will remember that they were warm. And then, after a moment because she saw the girl's face. That is not a small thing to be. That is the whole of it, in fact. Everything else they can get elsewhere. She had cried about it that night. Years later, she thought it the truest sentence anyone had ever said to her. On the shelf near the lamp, there was a small tin box with a hinged lid. Inside it, arranged with some care, were the things that room needed at night: a spare candle, a packet of matches, a folded cloth, a stub of pencil that nobody could account for. She listened once more from the doorway before she touched anything, which was habit and not necessity. She banked the nursery fire. She moved the guard aside and put it back. She checked the water in the jug on the washstand. She looked at the window band above the shutters once more before she went. She pulled her own door to the width it always sat at, which she could judge in the dark by the feel of the handle against her palm. Then she went back to her own room and lay down with the door open its hand's width. She did not sleep at once. Below her, on 3 floors, the house was doing what it did every night. The furnace held, the lamps burned low in their niches, the bread was rising in a warm kitchen, and it would be in the oven within the hour. Above her, over the slates, the snow went on falling. It fell on a whole city of children asleep in their rooms, warm or cold, watched or not. In this room they were warm. That was the whole of the work, and it was enough. The house below made one of its knocking sounds in a wall, and she heard it, and it meant nothing. The embers settled behind the guard with a small sound. The lamp on the shelf held its low flame, still and even. The 3 of them breathed on in the dark. Scene 9. The man who wound the clocks. There is a job in that house that sounds invented, and it was not. Somebody wound the clocks. There were a good many of them. A house of that size collected clocks the way it collected chairs. By that winter, there were perhaps 20 of them, standing or hanging in the rooms that mattered. They stood in the hall and on the stair landing and in the library and in the dining room and in the drawing room and in each of the principal bedrooms and in the corridor and in the housekeeper's room and in the servants' hall and in the kitchen. That last one mattered more than any of the others, and it was the plainest of the lot. They were not there to tell the hour, or not only for that. A clock in a room of that period was furniture first. It was made of marble, or ormolu, or carved wood, and it sat on a mantel or in a case against the wall. It was looked at far more often than it was read. The drawing-room clock had come from Paris and had a case of gilt bronze with figures on either side of the dial. The library one was English, black lacquer, sober as a bank. The kitchen one was a plain white dial in a wooden surround, hung high on the wall, where flour would not reach it, and it was the only clock in the building that anybody looked at with any urgency at all. But it also ran, and a thing that runs must be attended to. Almost. All of them were 8-day movements. That means a clock will run for 8 days on one winding. It sounds generous until you see what it meant in practice. Wind them all on the same day of the week, and you had one errand every 7 days. Everything stayed correct. Do it any other way. And they went out one by one at random through the month. You spent the rest of your life discovering stopped clocks. A stopped clock in a house of that kind was not a small thing either. It was noticed within a day, and it was mentioned, and it was the sort of remark that lands on one person and stays there. So it was done on a fixed day, at a fixed hour, by one man on a route. His name does not survive in anything I have read. I will not invent one for him. He was probably the butler or the under-butler. The point is that the job existed and one person held it. Everyone else in the household knew whose it was. He also carried a soft cloth, folded in the same pocket. Fingerprints on a polished dial are visible from across a room in the right light, and a man who winds 20 clocks and leaves 20 sets of fingerprints has made work for somebody else. There was a time before he had the roll. The keys were kept loose in a tin then. He lost one that way in his first month. He spent an entire afternoon finding it. He made the roll himself that same evening out of a piece of leather from the harness room. He carried the keys in a small leather roll. That is the detail that makes the whole thing real. Clock keys are not interchangeable. Every movement has its own square arbor and its own size. A key, one step too large, will round the corners off and ruin it. So each clock had its key. Each key had its pocket in the roll. The roll went into a drawer in the pantry between 1 week and the next. On this particular night, he did the round late, after the house had settled. That was when nobody was in the rooms. He carried no lamp. There was one burning at the foot of the stairs and one in the corridor above. And between them there was enough to work by if you knew the rooms, and he knew them better than he knew his own. The hall was cold. It was still. The marble held the sound of his shoes for a moment, then let it go. He began in the hall. The hall clock was the big one. It stood in a tall case against the wall by the stair, taller than he was. It had a heavy pendulum that swung behind a glass panel in the door. The case door had a small brass catch that had to be lifted rather than pulled. It had been fierce for years. He had oiled it once, and it had stayed stiff, and he had decided that it simply was stiff, and after that it stopped being a fault and became a feature of the object. He opened the case. There is a smell inside a tall case clock. Old oil, old wood, and a trace of metal. It is a small, closed volume of air, exchanged once a week and never otherwise. Anyone who has opened one knows it at once. He wound the going train, and then the striking trains. That is a separate winding and a separate hole. The crank went round with a ratcheting sound that has never been made by anything else. Inside, the two weights hung on their lines, and the winding brought them up slowly toward the top of their travel. Over the coming 8 days, they would descend again, an inch or so a day, doing the whole work of the clock by nothing more than falling. That is the entire principle of it, and there is something restful in knowing it. A weight goes up, a weight comes down. In between, the hands move. Then he set the pendulum, swinging with one finger, and closed the door on it. The beat came back, tick, and then tock. The tock a little different from the tick, as it always is in a good clock. He stood a moment to be sure it had settled into an even beat. A pendulum that is out of beat gives an uneven tick, a long gap, and then a short one, and it will run for a day or two like that, and then stop. You correct it by moving the case a hair on its feet. The case did not need moving. It had not needed moving in years. He stood there a moment longer than he needed to. He was listening to it settle. Then he went on. The library clock was a bracket clock on a shelf. The dining room had one on the mantel under a glass dome. The drawing room clock was French and gilt. Its movement was no larger than a man's fist, and it did a great deal of work. He wound them all, checking each dial against the watch in his waistcoat pocket, and moving the hands if they had drifted. Most of them had drifted by a minute or two, some fast, some slow, in no pattern that could be predicted. He set them all to the watch and thought nothing of it, and by the following week they would have drifted apart again. He moved them forward, never backward. That is a real rule and not a superstition, though it sounds like one. A striking clock has a mechanism that counts. Turning the hands backward past the striking point can jam it. So you go forward around the dial, waiting at each hour for the strike to finish, however slow it is. He had waited in a great many dark rooms for a clock to finish striking so that he could move it on another hour. The dining room clock under its dome was the fussiest. The dome had to be lifted straight up and set down on its side on the cloth so that it would not roll. Then the winding. Then the dome back on, straight, with the small felt ring seated properly in its groove. That is the sort of thing nobody thinks of when they picture a house like that one. When he reached the upper floors, the house was entirely still. There were smaller clocks up there, one on a landing, one in the corridor, and one in each of the principal bedrooms. Those he did not enter tonight, and would do in the morning. He wound the corridor clock, standing on the carpet in his soft shoes, and the sound of the crank was the loudest thing on that floor. He worked slowly, because nothing about the job could be hurried, and there was no reason at all to try. Now and then, he stopped and listened. This is the part that is genuinely strange and worth sitting with for a moment. If you have never stood in a house full of clocks late at night, this will not have occurred to you. 20 clocks in one building do not agree. They cannot. Even the best of them gains or loses a few seconds in a week, and the differences are not the same in every room. A clock's rate changes with temperature. A room with a fire in it runs at a different speed from a room without one. So the house at night was full of ticking that was very nearly, but never exactly, in step with itself. He stood on the stair with the hall clock below him and the corridor clock above. He could hear the two of them going in and out of step. They would come together for a while and beat as one, and then drift apart. And there would be church where the sound doubled and softened. Then they would come back together again. There is a name for that effect in other trades. In a house, it has no name at all. It is simply what a hall sounds like at 2 in the morning if you happen to be standing in it. He had noticed this in his first year and had never got tired of it. The house had a pulse, and the pulse was not quite regular, and it was made by 20 separate machines that nobody was listening to. He thought sometimes about how many hours of his life had gone into that one task. A quarter of an hour a week, near enough, upon year. It came to something. He had never worked out what, and he had no particular wish to. It is one of the few tasks in a household with a visible end. 20 clocks, and then none. Then a week of not thinking about them. He finished the round on the second floor. The last thing he did was the same every week. He stood at the head of the stair with the leather roll in his hand. He listened to the whole building at once. Hall clock, slow and deep. Corridor clock, quicker and higher. Somewhere below, the drawing room one, so faint that you had to want to hear it. All of it going. All of it wound for another 8 days, not one of them agreeing with any of the others, and none of it mattering in the slightest. Nobody would look at any of those dials before morning. Most of those who looked at them then would not really see them. That did not matter. He would not touch any of them again for 8 days, and none of them would need him to. He put the roll in his pocket and went down the back stairs. The leather roll sat in his coat pocket with its keys in their pockets, and it would sit in the pantry drawer by morning. Behind him, the clocks went on, in and out of step with one another. They marked a night that nobody in that house was awake to measure. Scene 10. The stable behind the house. There is one more building to visit before the night turns, and it is not the house. Behind the mansion, across a narrow paved yard, there was a stable. It faced onto a service street at the back, the sort of street that ran behind every row of great houses in that city, and that almost nobody who lived in them ever walked down. Deliveries came that way. Coal came that way. The horses lived that way. The yard between the house and the stable was paved in blue stone. It sloped very slightly toward a drain in the middle. That slope was the reason it did not ice over in the way flat yards do. It was a solid brick building of 2 floors. The ground floor held the stalls and the harness room and the standing space for 2 carriages. The floor above held hay and feed, and 2 small rooms where the men slept. There was a stair to the upper floor, more a ladder than a stair. It had a rope along the wall for a handrail. There was a trap in the ceiling over the stalls with a hatch. Hay could be dropped straight down into the racks without carrying it around. The whole place smelled of 4 things, and the 4 have not changed in any century: hay, leather, horse, and the particular clean ammonia sharpness that a well-kept stable has and a badly kept one has far too much of. This one was well kept. The floor was laid in blue brick, set on edge, in a herringbone. Shallow channels ran to a drain at the end of the row. That flooring was chosen for grip. A horse on smooth stone in wet weather will eventually go down. There were 3 horses in it that winter, a matched pair for the carriage, and a single cob for the light work, the errands, the daily business of a household that needed things fetched. The pair were bays. They were matched in height and in the way they moved. That is what matching means, and it is what cost so much to achieve. The cob was a plainer animal. He did 4 times the work. They were standing now, which is what horses mostly do at night. That surprises people. A horse sleeps standing up for most of its rest, locking its legs in a way that costs it almost nothing, and it lies down only for short stretches and only when it feels safe. In a good stable, it will lie down. In a bad one, it will not, all winter. 2 of these were down in the straw. The third, the cob, was standing at the front of his stall with his head low and his eyes half shut, and he shifted his weight from one hind foot to the other every so often, which is the sound a stable makes at night. That and the chewing. There is always some chewing going on in a stable after dark. Somebody finds a last strand of hay in the corner of the manger and works at it for a while. It is a slow, regular, contented sound, and it is one of the most restful sounds there is. The harness room next door was the tidiest room in either building. Bridles hung on their hooks, each with the throat lash fastened round to keep its shape. Collars on pegs, a saddle horse in the middle, with a rug over it. Along one wall, a shelf with the tins and bottles and cloths of the trade. The room smelled of oil and soap. It clung to anyone who spent an hour in there. Every piece of leather in that room had been cleaned that evening. Not because it was dirty. Leather that goes uncleaned goes hard. Hard leather cracks. A cracked rein is not a small matter on a slippery street. The lantern hung by the door turned low. It was in a metal cage, and it was hung well away from anything that could catch, because fire in a stable is the one thing everyone in that trade feared above all others, and every rule in the building came back to it in the end. No smoking, no open flame carried into a stall, straw swept back from the walls, hay stored above and not below. There were buckets of sand in a rack by the door. Everyone in that yard knew where they were without looking. The man who slept upstairs had been in stables since he was a boy, and he had never once broken any of those rules. He came down about 2. Not for any reason. He did that most nights, and he could not have told you why, and every person who has ever had animals in their care would recognize it exactly. His room above was small. It smelled of hay through the floorboards. It was warmer than any servant's room in the big house across the yard. Heat rises, and there were 3 large animals directly underneath it. He came down the ladder stair in his shirt and a coat thrown over it. The cob lifted his head and looked at him, and then put it down again, which is the whole of what a horse thinks about a familiar person at 2 in the morning. The sound of a stable at night is worth listening to properly. There is the shifting of a foot in straw. There is the slow blowing out through the nostrils that a resting horse does. There is the clop of a shod hoof against brick when one of them moves a step and settles again. None of it is loud. All of it is regular. The water buckets sat in iron rings at the front of each stall, at the height of a horse's chest. They had been filled at 9 and topped at 11. He walked the line. Water in each bucket. He put a hand into one to check it had not frozen, which it had not, because the stable held its heat well, and 3 horses make a surprising amount of it. Hay in each rack, enough, not too much. He looked at the straw in each stall as he went. It had been banked up against the walls in the evening in the way that was done. An animal lying down would not be against cold brick. Rugs sitting straight on the 2 that were rugged, because a rug that has slipped will rub a shoulder raw over a few hours, and there is no undoing that quickly. He straightened one and buckled it a hole tighter. He ran a hand down the cob's neck on the way past. That was not part of the inspection. It was the reason he had come down. Then he stood at the end of the row with his hands in his coat pockets and let the place go on around him. There was a clock in the harness room, a plain one. It was the only clock in that yard. It was wound by the same man who wound the 20 in the house. The carriage stood under a cover in the bay by the doors. It had been washed down when it came in that evening, and the wheels had been done, and the harness was on its pegs in the room next door, with the buckles turned the right way. The lamps on the carriage had been trimmed, too. Candle lamps in that period, in brass cases with beveled glass. They were done in exactly the same way, and for the same reasons as the lamps inside the house. All of it was ready. That was the whole point of a stable, and it is the part people miss. The work was not the driving. The work was being ready to drive at any hour, on 10 minutes' notice, in any weather, all year. If the household wanted the carriage at 6 in the morning, it would be at the door at 6. Nothing about that happened by itself. In the corner near the door there was a barrow and a fork and a broom. The bristles of the broom had worn to a slant, The same man had used it in the same direction for years. He looked at the doors, barred. He looked at the lantern, low, caged, safe. Outside, through the small window by the doors, he could see the snow coming down in the service street and settling on the cobbles and on the roofs of the stables opposite. Every one of those buildings had a man in it, or two, sleeping over the animals, doing exactly what he was doing. There was an old coachman he had worked under in his first place in the country, who had said a thing to him that he had carried ever since. They had been standing in a stable much like this one, late after a long day. "They cannot tell you anything," the old man said. "That is the whole job. You look because they cannot say." And then, in the way of old men who have decided to say the second half, do it every night when there is nothing wrong. Then, the night there is something wrong, you will already be standing here. The younger man had thought that was rather grand at the time. He had come to understand it as simple arithmetic. You cannot check only when you suspect. Suspicion arrives too late. So he came down at 2 most nights and found nothing and went back up. He did that now. He took a last look along the row. 3 horses, 2 down, 1 standing, water unfrozen, hay in the racks, doors barred, lantern low in its cage. He turned the lantern down another notch on his way past to the smallest flame it would hold. He went up the ladder stair. The stable settled behind him, warm and dim and quiet, with its 4 smells and its small sounds. Across the yard, the great house stood dark on every floor but one landing. Beyond it, the avenue. Beyond that, the park under snow. And beyond the park, the rest of a city doing the same thing in 1,000 smaller yards. In perhaps 4 hours, a man would come down that ladder again, in the dark, and light a lamp, and begin the whole business over. The lantern held its small flame in its cage by the door, where it would hold it until first light. Until then, the horses rested, and the straw shifted, and somebody in the corner went on chewing at nothing in particular. Scene 11. The hour when nobody works. There is an hour in a house like that one, when nothing at all is being done. It comes late, later than most people would guess. The dinner has been cleared and the silver counted. The lamps have been trimmed and set. The pins are in their dish and the hair is brushed out. The furnace has been fed and will hold for 2 more hours. The clocks are wound, the horses are settled, and the bread has not yet been started. That gap is perhaps 90 minutes wide, somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning, and in that gap the house is doing nothing whatsoever, and neither is anybody in it. Let us stand in it for a while. It is not an hour anyone chose. It simply falls out of the arithmetic of the work. The evening tasks end when they end, and the morning tasks cannot begin any earlier than they do, and what is left between them belongs to nobody. Begin at the top. Above the nursery, there were the servants' rooms, up under the slates, and those rooms were cold. The heat from the furnace did not reach so far, and nobody had ever expected it to. The rooms up there were small, and they had sloping ceilings on one side, following the line of the roof so that a person could stand upright only in the middle of the floor. The windows were dormers, and they were small, and half of them did not open properly. There were iron bedsteads and horsehair mattresses and a great many blankets, because blankets were cheaper than heat. Each room held 2 or 3 people. There was a washstand with a jug and a basin, and the water in the jug had a skin of ice on it by 4 in the morning most nights that winter, and everybody up there knew to break it with the back of a hand rather than a knuckle. The windows up there had frost on the inside. That is not a hardship to be dwelt on. It was simply how the top of a house worked, and it was the same in every house on the street, and the people sleeping in those rooms had grown up in cold rooms and would have found a warm one difficult to sleep in. They slept well. Working people sleep well. That is one of the few advantages of the arrangement. On a hook behind each door hung the next day's apron. In the corner of one room there was a box with a lid, and in the box the things a person owns when they own very little. A letter or two, a photograph, a spare pair of stockings folded. Below them, the nursery floor, warmer, with its lamp turned low and its fire guard in place. The corridor on that floor had a runner down the middle of it and boards showing at the edges, and the boards had been polished, and at that hour there was nothing on them but the faint shine of a lamp at the far end. Below that, the bedrooms. Those rooms were the warmest in the house because they were on the pipe run and the doors had been closed since 11. Each one held its person and a jug of water and a candle within reach and a clock ticking on a mantel that nobody would look at until morning. Below that, the family floor, empty now, the drawing room in the dark with its chairs pushed back, the library with its lamp burning low on the long table, exactly as it had been left. The library lamp had burned down by perhaps a third since it was set. It would burn another 2 hours and then need turning out. And somebody would do that on their way past before the house woke. Below that, the hall, with its marble floor and its cold air and its tall case clock going in the corner. There was a draught in that hall. There always is in a hall with a great door in it, however well the door is made. It came in low, along the marble and went up the stairwell, and it was the reason the hall was the coldest room in the building at every hour of the night. Below that, the kitchen floor, warm as an oven, with the range banked and the dough rising under its cloth. Below that, the furnace and one man on a stool, doing nothing, listening. And in between all of it, the back stairs, plain wood, no carpet, running from the cellars to the roof in one continuous line, with a turn at every floor and a small window at every turn, Every person in this story used that stair. Almost nobody in the family had ever set foot on it. 6 levels, and on every one of them, the same thing was true. Nothing was happening. It is worth staying with that for a moment because it is rare. In a working household, there is almost always somebody doing something. This is the one stretch of the day when that is not true. This is what a house sounds like at that hour. The clocks, of course, 20 of them, in and out of step with one another, the sound coming through walls and floors so that you never hear one clearly, only the general fact of them. They are not together and they are not apart. They are simply many, in different rooms, at different distances, going at their own rates. The pipes, a radiator upstairs cooling by 1/2 degree and letting a little water move, and the movement arriving as 2 small taps somewhere in a wall. The wood, the whole building giving back its heat, and the joists and the treads and the frames moving a hair's width as they do it, and each movement making its one small sound in the dark. Snow on glass. That is the faintest of all, and you only notice it when you stop and look for it. It is not a hiss. It is the absence of a hiss. Somehow, a softening of the outside that tells you the weather has not stopped. And now and then, from somewhere, a single sound with no explanation at all. A knock. A shift. Something in a chimney. Every old building produces these, and no old building explains them, and the people who live in one long enough stop asking. And under all of it, so low that it barely counts as sound, the furnace. You could feel that one more than hear it. A great, warm, slow breathing at the bottom of the building, holding everything above it a few degrees above the night. Consider what that means for a moment, without hurrying over it. At that hour, the richest family in the country was doing exactly what everyone else in the city was doing, lying down, breathing evenly, not knowing anything. They were not richer while asleep. Nobody is. Sleep is the one part of a life that money has never been able to improve very much, and everything that had gone into that house, the marble, the mahogany, the silver in its baize drawers, did nothing at all for the 6 people lying down in it. The house around them was enormous, and it was full of very expensive objects, and not one of those objects mattered in the slightest at 3 in the morning. What mattered was that the rooms were warm, and that the roof held, and that somebody in the cellar had spread the coal to the corners. That is the entire arrangement. And it was the same arrangement in a tenement 4 miles east, where a family slept around a stove that somebody had banked, under blankets that somebody had spread. The difference was scale. The difference, hence, was how many people it took. It was not, at 3 in the morning, a difference in kind. There were, at a guess, 30 people asleep under that roof, and 6 of them were the family, and the other 24 were the reason the 6 of them were comfortable. There is a moment in that hour when the house seems to hold still altogether. The wood stops moving because it has finished cooling. The pipes have nothing left to settle. Nobody turns over, nobody coughs. For perhaps a minute, the only thing going is the clocks. And then the minute ends, as it always does. Then something small happens. A coal falls in the kitchen grate. A horse shifts in the stable across the yard. The man on the avenue comes past under the window with snow squeaking under his boots. And the house starts again in the way it does. That minute is real, and anyone who has been awake at that hour in an old building has been inside one. It is not eerie, it is the opposite of eerie. It is the sound of a very large thing resting with everything that keeps it running already done, and nothing left to do until the morning asks for something. If you had been standing on the stair at that hour, between the hall below and the corridor above, you would have heard the whole building at once. It is not a sound anyone alive has heard in quite that combination, and it will not be heard again. Every one of those levels had a person on it who would be up before 6. Not one of them had set an alarm. There was nothing of the kind in that house, and there did not need to be. People who rise at the same hour every day of their lives rise without being called. The snow went on falling on the roof. It had covered the carved stone and the ironwork and the wide front steps. It had filled the tracks in the avenue for the 4th time that night. It lay along the branches in the park in thin white lines, exactly the width of each branch. Inside, on 6 levels, a household slept. The lamp burned low on the landing. The fire held in the cellar. The clocks went in and out of step in the dark. In the stable across the yard, a man was already back under his blankets. The animals below him had not moved. And for that hour, nobody in that house was doing anything at all. Scene 12. The same night, everywhere. Let us go outside one last time and go a little further than the avenue. The snow that was falling on that house was falling on the whole city. It did not know where it was falling. It came down on the carved limestone and the iron work and the wide front steps, and it came down at exactly the same rate, in exactly the same lines, on everything else. It fell on the park across the way, on the bare trees, on the frozen surface of the little lake, on the empty benches with their white ridges. It fell on the avenue running north. House after house after house. Each one was dark on every floor but a landing. Each one had its own furnace burning at the bottom of it. It fell on the side streets between the avenues. The houses there were narrower. The stone was brown stone rather than limestone. The families inside them kept 2 servants instead of 30. The arithmetic was otherwise identical. It fell on the streets going east, where the houses got narrower and the windows got closer together. It fell on the tenements by the river, 6 stories of them. There was a stove in every room. In every room, there was somebody who had banked that stove before lying down. It fell on the fire escapes, filling the treads and the little iron landings, where people sat in July and where nobody had sat for months. It fell on the rooftops where laundry had been left out too long and had gone stiff in the cold. It fell on the river itself and disappeared into it without leaving a mark. It fell on the docks, on the coiled ropes, and the bollards and the decks of moored boats, and on the water between them, where it vanished the moment it touched. It fell on the ferry slips. A man was awake in a wooden hut there, with a coal fire and a kettle. He was waiting for a boat that would not come until first light. It fell on the freight yards, on the roofs of 1,000 motionless wagons, on the switch shanties, where more men sat with more small fires. It fell on the horse-car barns, where a great many animals stood in the dark in row upon row, each of them with somebody responsible for it. It fell on the market sheds, where the earliest of all the workers in that city were already moving in the dark, because a market is loaded before anybody else is awake. It fell on the elevated railway, on the rails and the ties and the roofs of the little stations, and along the whole length of it there was nothing moving at all. It fell on the churches and the schools and the workshops with their shutters down. It fell on the hospitals. Their windows were lit all night as a matter of course. Somebody was walking a corridor there with a lamp at that very hour, for reasons not unlike a watchman's. It fell on the rope walks and the timber yards and the low sheds along the water where nothing was happening either. It fell on the bridges, on the cables, and the walkways and the wide, empty roadway between them. And out beyond all of it, it fell on the farms up the valley, on barns with animals standing in the dark, on farmhouses where a woman had banked a stove that evening. She had done it exactly as a cook had banked a range on Fifth Avenue. Same reason, same movement of the hand. It fell on the fields beyond the farms evenly, on nothing at all, with nobody to see it, which is what snow does nearly everywhere, nearly always. Consider that for a moment, gently, without making anything of it. On that night, in that weather, a very great number of people were doing one small task each to keep something from going out. A fire, a lamp, a child, a horse, a clock, a loaf of bread rising under a cloth in a warm room. None of them knew about the others. Almost none of them would be thanked. Most were doing it half asleep, out of habit, in a cold room. They were thinking about nothing in particular while they did it. Some of them were doing it for wages, some for family, some out of nothing more than the habit of having always done it. The reasons made no difference at all to the outcome. And in the morning, all of it would simply have worked. The bread would be warm on a plate. The rooms would be warm through the walls. The carriage would be at the door with the harness right. The clocks would be going. The lamps would be full. And the odd thing, the thing worth carrying out of all of this, is that nothing about it was remarkable to anybody involved. Not one of those people thought they were doing anything worth mentioning. Ask any of them, and they would have said they had done nothing in particular. Nobody would ask how. None of it was coordinated. That is the part worth holding on to. There was no plan behind it, no list, nobody at the center of it counting. It was simply a very large number of separate people, each attending to the one small thing that was theirs. That is what a night is, in a house or in a city. It is a very large number of small things. Each one is being kept from going out by somebody nobody is looking at. It was true on that avenue. It was true across the river. It was true on the farms. It was true for a great many years. It was true again the following night. It went on being true after every single person in this story had gone. The house on the corner is not there anymore, and most of those houses are not either. The avenue is still there. The park is there. The snow falls on it in the same lines, at the same rate, indifferent to what lies underneath. And somewhere in that city tonight, somebody is awake at 3 in the morning. They are keeping something small from going out. They will not be thanked either, and it will not occur to them to expect it. It is not the sort of work that comes with thanks. It never has been, and the people who do it have never once complained about that part of it. The snow went on falling evenly over all of it. Nobody in this story knew any of the others existed, and it made no difference at all. The house slept, and the city slept, and the work of the night was already done. You do not need to remember anything you heard tonight. There will be no questions in the morning. If one small room of that house stayed with you, let that be enough. And if nothing stayed, that is fine too. The past does not mind being forgotten. It goes on quietly either way. If you are still with us, thank you for staying. If you have already drifted off, thank you for that too. The world has been turning for a very long time. Tonight, it can turn without you. You are allowed to rest. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us here at Midnight Archive.